So first of all, I think it was evident from yesterday's presentations that the global benchmarking tool used and the benchmarking exercise and WLA are two different procedures. So as we mentioned yesterday, the global benchmarking tool was purposely designed to generate capacity building. WLA is purposely designed to generate reliance and focused on performance of the regulatory systems, not on the basic structure of the regulatory systems, which is the main focus of the GBT. So why do we need to move from one to the other? For a number of reasons, and I think that the most important one is to facilitate access all over the world. When we talk about facilitating access, it seems something very generic, very imprecise, something without a context that might not matter a lot for a number of countries. In reality, it matters for all countries, as we have seen during COVID-19, when most developed countries didn't have basic instruments to fight some of the illness, like, for example, and I'm coming from Europe, I remember in Europe, on the first 2 months of confinement, we didn't have paracetamol, we didn't have PPEs. And I, as a person, as a citizen, I remember the first day I had the PPE, an FFP2 mask in my hands. I paid 24 euros for one, and I was very glad for finally having one. So access has two dimensions. As a dimension about the generation of supply chain, and global and regionally distributed manufacturing chains are absolutely essential. But in order for them to exist, they need also regulatory oversight, an appropriate regulatory oversight. Just sharing with you some of the things that are not really public, because they need to be done on a closed room between the different interpreters of the system. The most critical meeting I participated during that period was in February-March 2021, when there was an agreement between WHO and international financial institutions not to fund any manufacturing activities or projects that were not associated with a regulatory system strengthening. And I think this is a very important political decision that was taken in a very difficult moment in the middle of the fight against COVID-19, but brought us to the context where we are. I can tell you that I'm almost 5 years now in this position at WHO. I came in the middle of COVID-19, and until today, I didn't add any experience about having a head of state, a prime minister, a minister of health from any country in the world saying they don't want to strengthen their regulatory system. And basically, that goes back to that previous decision, which is to have a comprehensive framework in which you cannot move within the system without appropriate regulatory oversight. Just to remember, what are the consequences of not having appropriate regulatory oversight? Probably the most dramatic ones are the ones that we are living for 3 years and not over yet, with the killing of infants and babies with cough syrups contaminated with ethylene glycol and ethylene glycol. This is not a problem from a specific country. This is not a problem of Indian manufacturers. This is a global problem. And I can tell you without going into too much details, because there's an active Interpol investigation on this aspect for the last 3 years. If you go back to the report that our department published together with the UNODC a couple of months ago, you can see the criminal networks that are associated with some of these aspects. For example, in the illegal use of containers for raw materials, legal raw materials used in the pharmaceutical industry, but then the empty containers used by dark side criminal activities for using those containers with solvents like ethylene glycol and ethylene glycol. It's purely criminal activity, and a criminal activity that is probably the most dramatic example of lack of capacity of regulation. Unfortunately, on this aspect, it impacts everybody. It can happen today in Korea and can happen tomorrow in the United States of America, simply because the current framework for the regulatory systems, we still don't have an appropriate control of the raw materials before they enter the manufacturing chain. And as you fully understand, because you are experienced on the area, our regulatory oversight over excipients is based on the quality control that is performed at the entry of the manufacturing site. But if we don't have an appropriate control done at the entry of the manufacturing site, you have a cascade of events that can be as dramatic as the ones that we have experienced in the last 3 years. So still a lot to do. I'm not advocating over-regulation, it's not that. It's about having the need for having traceability of raw materials between the manufacturing of the raw materials and the moment they enter the manufacturing supply chain for pharmaceuticals, which is a very important one. And this is one of the topics of many other topics that we are still working on, how to improve the performance of regulatory systems, how to enter on a continuous improvement of the regulatory systems. So when we go back to GBT and WLA, I think it's very important to understand that the decision that we took, for example, to have a first assessment for WLA followed by a second assessment, and then that's the final assessment, is based also on that concept of continuous improvement. If you are a WLA, it means that your regulatory system is performing at a level of continuous improvement that is double-checked a second time, 5 years after the first one, but in principle, it should be something that is there to stand alone, not needing WHO to come back and do an assessment every 5 years. As I explained yesterday also, WHO still keeps some control over the system, and I gave you the example of the terrible decision that we might need to take during next year concerning the US FDA, and related with lack of communication and lack of transmission of regulatory documents between regulatory agencies. So we'll be always there vigilant with a mandate, by the way, because WHO is not some kind of strange entity in the middle of the cloud. WHO is controlled by WHA, the World Health Assembly, where 194 member states sit, take the decisions. I normally say, at the risk of being fired when returning to Geneva, that the member states decide everything. They decide our mandate, they decide our work plan, they decide our budget. The only thing they don't, they elect our Director General. The only thing they don't do is to give us enough money to do our job, which is a separate issue. And there's a financial reform of WHO that was approved by the member states in 2022 and might give us a better chance to have 50% of our budget as a contribution from the member states by 2030. But we are still going on that direction, and it will be still 50% and not 100%. So departments like mine, to perform what we do every day, we based our funding mostly on the fees from the pre-qualification process and also on voluntary contributions from institutions. And I have to say that I have at least 5 of the 20 institutions that contribute with voluntary contributions to our department. 5 of them are very impressive ones, because are the Gates Foundation, UNITAID, UNICEF, Gavi, and the Global Fund. And without those 5 institutions, it will be very difficult for us to provide the support to member states that we provide every day. We have also minor contributions under voluntary contribution schemes for dedicated aspects. For example, after this morning's session, I will go to another location in Seoul for a workshop organized by my department with manufacturers of diagnostics for neglected tropical diseases. And that's an activity that we have with a grant provided by the government of Republic of Korea, that even though being less important than the 5 ones that I mentioned, are critically important for areas like neglected tropical diseases. But coming back to our topic, I think that the most important to understand is these contextual differences. GBT is the beginning of the process. It's about the architecture of the regulatory system. It's about checking that the elements are there, and they need to be there and acting in a comprehensive manner. As you have seen yesterday from the numbers, from close to 280 indicators, close to 240 are for the minimum functionality of those regulatory systems. We have 68% of the member states of WHO that still don't have any minimum functionality. And for the remaining 32%, some of them, like the examples I mentioned yesterday for India and China, they only cover vaccines and not medicines. And this is an ongoing discussion that we have. So WLA, where MFDS is now, after many years that we have seen yesterday, almost 4 years and 4.5 years of a very intense work that started with a target to become ML4. And if you remember the indicators from yesterday, if you are ML3, you can propose yourself to become WLA and go through the assessment. But if you are ML4, of course, you are in a stronger position to do that last mile, because anyway, if you are ML3, during the WLA process, you will have to do most of the ML4 indicators, and in both stages, also the performance evaluation indicators for the regulatory system. So the decision, the example, and someone will address the issue about the experience of Republic of Korea, but I think that the example of Republic of Korea has been a very good example, with a strong determination from the government and from the regulator to be ML4 at the start of the process and then moving to WLA and not losing time, because the most important in these processes is to avoid that national pride will get on the way of the work that we need to do. Unfortunately, we have a number of countries that are always afraid of the consequences of being exposed publicly about the consequence of doing the assessment. And my message is always the same. The later you start, the later you end. And to be very transparent, as I like to be in these kind of meetings, even last week I was addressing multiple CEOs from vaccine manufacturers from India that were discussing with me. Indian government is not yet submitting, and I told them, you know, you need to use all the pressure that you can use on your government, because by the end you are the ones being penalized because you don't have access to a breach pre-qualification with the vaccines manufactured in India, because the regulatory system in India is not yet WLA. So by the end, there are two components here that are very important, is the lack of access or quicker access to global markets by the manufacturers in one location, and as a consequence of that, lack of access in volume, access in quality assured, affordable, and in an equitable manner, which is the mandate that WHO has from the 194 member states. So WLA, as a consequences of WLA, the first most important consequence of WLA is to have adequate reliance mechanisms that will impact first on the procurement policies, and this is of course in terms of the reliance mechanisms that are there, but also in ensuring that the products with adequate quality and the adequate regulatory oversight are being accessed by the populations that need them. Let me give you an example that most of the time we don't discuss, because we are looking mostly towards marketing authorization function. If you look, for example, to the clinical trials function, the fact that you don't have a regulatory system that is performing well in terms of oversight of clinical trials will mean that global industry will not perform clinical trials in your country. And for some innovative technologies, that means that the patients with unmet medical needs that need quick access, even during the clinical development to those new technologies, will not have access to those new technologies simply because your country is not going to be selected by industry because you don't have an adequate regulatory oversight. And as a consequence of that, any clinical development that is done in your country is completely useless for the submission for marketing authorization by the global companies. So it's a much more complex scenario than it seems when you look only at the component of marketing authorization. Is the full spectrum etc., and the life cycle management, including research and development through clinical development. So in material terms, in the work that we do and immediate impact from being WLA is, of course, a bridge pre-qualification. And it's, of course, also the use of facilitating mechanisms like the collaborative registration procedure. As I told you yesterday, I would be very happy if we would be in a position that we could shut down pre-qualification, because that would mean that we have strong regulatory systems everywhere. Unfortunately, it is not the case, and there's a mission for WHO to be present, to supplement the needs from member states that don't have still the technical capacity. And to do that, I can tell you, it's not a joke, it's real. A discussion I had with my Director General a couple of months ago, before the restructuring, and we were discussing this, and I was telling him, you know, I think that pre-qualification one day will need to be shut down, and that's a consequence of our success in the next decades. And we agreed on that point, but we disagreed on the temporal line. So for me, it's probably, we are 20 years away from that moment. From my Director General, he's more stubborn than myself, I can tell you. He was telling me, probably, Rogerio, are wrong, probably we'll need 30 years to arrive there. But anyway, there will be a moment that WHO will have to shut down pre-qualification because it will not be needed, because the regulatory systems will be there to perform their tasks. And for us, this is something that is not dramatic. It's not about us, it's about the systems. The collaborative registration procedure and addressing the issue about WLAs, I have also to say that not everything is shining. We have a number of cases on the collaborative registration procedure where the collaborative registration procedure with the SRAs, stringent regulatory authorities, and in the future, after now the WLAs, after the decision taken last week by the expert committee on standards for pharmaceutical products. We have a number of examples in the last years where the timelines for national approvals through the CRP for SRAs is longer than in the case of pre-qualified products. And this is something that is an operational difficulty because it has to do with the speed and transparency of transmission of information by the stringent regulatory authorities. Now with the WLAs, the context becomes a bit different, but also because the receiving countries, the countries that don't have technical capacity, that need really CRP to support the national registration, some of these countries still want to do a further assessment, even if they don't have technical capacity to do it, and they still want to do a further inspection. And some of my colleagues and some of the member states are a bit puzzled with that attitude because it seems completely counterproductive in terms of what we are doing. But as a simple explanation, in some of these countries, the main issue is about the fees of the process, because the national regulatory authorities, even though weak from the technical perspective, they still need to pay salaries, and they still have a number of weaknesses in their funding mechanisms. So having supplementary fees justified by supplementary assessment is also an issue for them in order to provide their survival in terms of the financial stability. That's why for us it's very important when we do the GBT and also when we do the WLA to ensure that the national regulatory authorities are not only independent in the sense not that they are not in the government, but independent in the sense that regulatory decisions cannot be overruled by political decisions, and we need to verify that in the law, in the national law, those provisions exist, because if they don't exist, you'll never be an ML3 and you never move ahead. That's something very clear for us. But at the same time, that legislation on the countries provide the necessary limits in terms of guaranteeing the financial independence and the mechanisms for the financial independence of the national regulatory authority. We have seen in the past a number of countries where decisions that were not very sympathetic to specific governments were reacted by cuts in the budget of the national regulatory authorities by the governments as a way to control politically those national regulatory authorities. So we are very vigilant on those aspects, and we are vigilant in terms of the legislation, but also in terms of the enforcement of the legislation. Just to give you an example, because I know that some of you like more to have examples that you can memorize, not to make it a very dry presentation. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Moscow discussing with the Minister of Health of the Russian Federation. And the main problem, for example, in the regulatory system of the Russian Federation is that the GMP inspections is not under the authority of the National Regulatory Authority, but under the authority of the Minister of Industry and Economical Development, which means that the GMP inspection, the driver for a GMP inspection is not public health, but is economic considerations in terms of the development of the companies. And this was, by the way, the basis for a number of problems during COVID-19 that led WHO to take a strong position blocking the approval of Sputnik on the emergency use listing by WHO. That was the corner problem, a number of GMP failures on the manufacturing of Sputnik. The root cause for those failures is lack of regulatory oversight, because the regulatory oversight is not unified and is stratified according to multiple issues. So one of the issues that I was guaranteeing to Minister Mikhail Murashko, which, by the way, before becoming Minister of Health in Russia, he was the head of the regulatory system in Russia, so he knows the alphabet of the system quite well, is that for us it's not only the change on the legislation, we need to have at least 9 months to 1 year of verification of the implementation of the new legislation according to the international standards. And this is what we do systematically during the capacity building for the GBT, and this is something also very critical in terms of the process for WLA. So when you heard yesterday that for Republic of Korea or Singapore, even though they were ML4, even though they were in a pilot, it still took them 2 years to complete the cycle for a number of regulatory functions is not something abnormal. It's because it's not only introducing the changes, it's to provide evidence that the changes are impactful, they are implemented, and we have ways to verify the implementation of those changes. So this is the rule of the game, and I think for those of you that will be in the future on a position to support national regulatory authorities, both for GBT or for WLA, is something that you need to understand in the behavior of WHO. Is not going there and looking at a checklist. It's a process, and it's a process that takes time because it needs to take time. It needs to be verified and counter-verified, needs to have capacity building in terms of training. I can give you a number. We have a platform which is not WHO. WHO is the secretariat. We call it the Coalition of Interested Parties. It has more than 30 institutions. The USP, the European Medicines Agency, EDQM, Gates, CEPI. The last one to enter was the World Bank and CEPI. So those 30 institutions, they participate on the Coalition of Interested Parties with the sole purpose of supporting the national regulatory authorities that are in the maturation process. The rule of the game being that participating in that platform that is managed by WHO but not owned by WHO, is owned by the participant institutions, they get access through confidentiality arrangements to the WHO confidential reports under agreement by the member states that are related with the performance evaluation or the capacity building, depending on every single step of the specific country. That platform, in the last 3 years, invested $125 million in bringing more capacity for national regulatory authorities. 80% of that investment was done in Africa. 80% of the investment in Africa was done in Senegal and Rwanda. So it's not by chance that Senegal and Rwanda had a relatively quick access to ML3. It's based on capacity that needs to be built and coalition of efforts to support that capacity And to support that capacity, you need to have the numbers, because you need to have the staff, you need to have the technical capacity, you need to have the funds to do that, and you need to have the independence of the regulatory authority to manage those funds on a sustainable manner in the future and to move ahead. So it's not by magic, it's by design, and by a strict design that WHO brings together all these tools, the CIP, the GBT, the institutional development plans, the training of regulators. And when we look at pharmacovigilance, and just the segue for pharmacovigilance, we have on pharmacovigilance, I would say, a baseline, a very strong baseline. We'll be celebrating in 2028 the 50th anniversary of the Uppsala Monitoring Center. The Uppsala Monitoring Center is not only a WHO collaborative center. The WHO collaborative center is one department of UMC. UMC as an institution is owned 50% by WHO and 50% by the Swedish government. Honestly, if we would try to do it today, it will be impossible. Our lawyers would be screaming all over the board because our framework for involvement with non-state actors, the FENSA, would completely block us from doing the same kind of engineering today. But 50 years ago, it was possible, and it was done. And so the management board of the Uppsala Monitoring Center, 50% of the members of the board are appointed by the Swedish government, 50% are appointed by WHO. The chair is always appointed by the Swedish government. The vice chair is always appointed by WHO. I was the vice chair until recently. The chair is a professor from the Karolinska Institute, and you have in the board people like CEOs from banks in Sweden, from insurance companies, and from WHO side, a couple of heads of national regulatory authorities. For example, the head of the regulatory authority of India is a member of the board of UMC appointed by WHO. And the 6 members of WHO that are on the board are representing the 6 regions, and also with, for the first time in the last 3 years, a gender balance, because that's something that I take very seriously. We talk a lot about gender balance, but we need to also to do the walk. And when I came to WHO, we had 5 men and 1 woman representing WHO in the board. Now we have 4 women and 2 men on the board, and completely unbalanced what was the previous gender balance. But coming back to UMC, UMC on pharmacovigilance is what I can consider the technical engine of global cooperation in pharmacovigilance. UMC has the technical capacity to do things like we did, for example, during COVID-19, to develop in a couple of weeks a mobile app that was at the center of the pharmacovigilance for COVID-19 vaccines in a huge number of countries in the world, most African countries, for example. It was developed by UMC in a couple of weeks, very fast. Also, during COVID-19, we had in 6 months a project that moved from project to product using artificial intelligence for VG-Base. So VG-Base today incorporates for the last 3.5 years already a number of components generated by artificial intelligence. This was developed in-house at UMC. UMC has the capacity, the technical capacity to do that. And, of course, the links with industry and regulators through the PIDM, which is the WHO program for drug monitoring all over the world. So, when we talk about WLA and pharmacovigilance, we cannot disaggregate what will be the coherence of the WLA platform from the enabling structure, which is the Uppsala Monitoring Center, to global coordination. We are not satisfied. And we are not satisfied because we know from experience that we can do much better. So one of the things I can announce, and this is the result of the restructuring that we went through in the last 5 months in Geneva, and was communicated for the first time last Friday by myself to our main funders under the authority of the Director General, is that from next year, we'll be establishing a new network of collaborative centers in pharmacovigilance, at least 1 per region, UMC will not be the governing body of that network. UMC will be the technical engine of that network, and the governance will be a shared governance between the different participating centers. I can also share that we are already, before I have any proposal coming from Korea, to say that I have already 3 proposals from the region where we are, the West Pacific region, and we'll be considering at this phase only one of them. So we are in the final stages of discussion with a number of member states. We want that those collaborative centers, even though they need to be located at one country, they would have an impact that is either global, specialized in specific areas. For example, something that we will need really to do in the next 2 or 3 years is to have a collaborative center on medical devices vigilance, for example. That is very critical for our plan of development, but with an impact that is not only national. So either it's global on a specific area, or in all areas, but at the regional level, being part of a global network. So building that strong capacity is something also important to structure what is the new dimension of the WLAs. We will be discussing with the current WLAs most probably before the end of 26, and certainly before March 2027, we will be discussing a governance mechanism for the WLAs, because we have one need and one difficulty. The difficulty is that the normal WHO mechanism, which is a member state mechanism, cannot be applied to WLA, because a member state mechanism by default is open to 194 member states, and WLA is not an open game. It's only open for those that met the standards and are at that level. So there's a difficulty that we have from the legal capacity of intervention of WHO, but we are discussing with our lawyers and with a couple of member states, and we really need to have a governance mechanism, because imagine that we have, probably we'll have 40 to 42 WLAs by March 2027. Imagine that those 40, let's put a round number, WLAs are there, and then we don't have any capacity of coordination between those WLAs. We'll have a number of problems to solve. So sooner than later, but certainly before March 27, we will need to step in with a mechanism. Can be a mechanism close to the coalition of interested parties, which is WHO being the secretariat and the participating WLAs being the real governance of the system. Because for us, the center of the system is not in Geneva, it's in the member states, and it's controlled by the member states and should be empowering the member states to do their work. But we certainly need to solve that. So in pharmacovigilance, that will be the same case. More important in pharmacovigilance, because the WLAs and the WHO new collaborative centers on pharmacovigilance, together with UMC, will be at the center, and because that network around pharmacovigilance will have an impact greater than WLA, because it will be essential to generate capacity also on the other regulatory agencies that are not yet WLA, and moving on that direction over time. So I think that I will stop here eventually. I don't know if I have still some time for questions. I wanted to have this more dynamic than yesterday. Before coming to WHO, I was 36 years an academic professor, researcher, and also working in industry for some time. And at Friday morning, 8 a.m., with the auditorium full of people that had a lovely night on Thursday night, because it's normally, at least in our context, the preferred night for students to get out. Professors normally have some clues to put people to step in, you know, and one typical one is to say, the ones that will not put questions will pay the dinner tonight, you know, something like that. So, and the other one, and more seriously, is that the only question that is not important is the question that you are not putting together. Because I think that all of you have a number of questions going through your minds, and this is an opportunity to clarify some of the aspects in what we can clarify. We don't have answer to all the problems. We don't have answer to all the questions. This is a process, as I told you, but at least there's an opportunity to engage more than we have engaged until now. Thank you.